The Black Jacobin, Toussaint L'Ouverture, and the San Domingo Revolution by C.L.R. James. Preface to the first edition. In 1798, the French West Indian colony of San Domingo supplied two-thirds of the overseas trade of France and was the greatest individual market for the European slave trade. It was an integral part of the economic life of the age, the greatest colony in the world, the pride of France, and the envy of every other imperialist nation. The whole structure rested on the labor of 500,000 slaves. In August 1791, after 2 years of the French Revolution, the slaves revolted. The struggle lasted for 12 years. The slaves' victories in this struggle resulted, in 1803, in the establishment of the Black State of Haiti, which has lasted to this day. The revolt is the only successful slave revolt in history. The transformation of slaves, trembling in hundreds before a single white man, into a people able to organize themselves and defeat the most powerful European nations of their day, is one of the great epics of revolutionary struggle and achievement. Toussaint L'Ouverture is the individual whose leadership holds most responsibility for this unique achievement. Therefore, this history will largely be a record of his achievements and his political personality. Great men make history, but only such history as it is possible for them to make. Their freedom of achievement is limited by the necessities of their environment. To portray the limits of those necessities and the realization, complete or partial, of all possibilities, that is the true business of the historian. In a revolution, when the ceaseless, slow accumulation of centuries bursts into volcanic eruption, the observer must see them always as projections of the subsoil from which they came. The writer focuses on the economic forces of the age, their molding of society and politics, and the rare moments when society is at boiling point and is therefore fluid. The violent conflicts of our age enable our practiced vision to see into the very bones of previous revolutions more easily than heretofore. Prologue. Christopher Columbus landed first in the New World at the island of San Salvador, looking for gold. The natives directed him to Haiti, which they said was rich in the yellow metal. The Spaniards annexed the island and called it Hispaniola. They introduced Christianity, forced labor in mines, murder, rape, bloodhounds, strange diseases, and artificial famine, by the destruction of cultivation to starve the rebellious. They reduced the native population from an estimated 500,000, perhaps a million, to 60,000 in 15 years. Las Casas, a Dominican priest, traveled to Spain to plead for the abolition of native slavery. The Spanish government compromised. It abolished forced labor in law, while its agents in the colony maintained it in fact. Las Casas, wanting to prevent the total destruction of a population within one generation, suggested importing the more robust people from a populous Africa. In 1517, Charles V authorized the export of 15,000 slaves to San Domingo, and thus priest and king launched on the world the American slave trade and slavery. Some wandering Frenchmen settled in the neighboring island of Tortuga and were followed by Englishmen and Dutchmen. French, British, and Spaniards slaughtered one another for nearly 30 years, but by 1659 the French buccaneers prevailed. They then moved to Santo Domingo. They resisted Spanish attempts to drive them out by diversifying their agricultural products and stealing money and slaves from the English island of Jamaica. In 1695, the Treaty of Ryswick between France and Spain gave the French a legal right to the western part of the island. But the French needed labor. In addition to Africans, they brought whites, who would be freed after a period of years. But since the whites could not stand the climate, the slavers brought more and more Africans, in numbers that leapt by thousands every year, until the drain from Africa ran into millions. Chapter 1. The Property. The slavers scoured the coasts of Guinea. As they devastated an area, they moved westward and then south, as far as Mozambique on the eastern side of Africa. Guinea remained their chief hunting ground. They set the simple tribesmen fighting against each other with modern weapons. Propagandists of the time claimed that however cruel was the slave traffic, the African slave in America was happier than in his own African civilization. But in the 16th century, Central Africa was a territory of peace and happy civilization. The tribal wars from which the European pirates claimed to deliver the people were overinflated. It was a great battle when half a dozen men were killed. Tribal life was broken up, and millions of detribalized Africans were let loose upon each other. The unceasing destruction of crops led to cannibalism. Tribes had to supply slaves or be sold as slaves themselves. Violence and ferocity became the necessities for survival, and violence and ferocity survived. These horrors were the product of an intolerable pressure on the African peoples. The slaves were collected in the interior, loaded with heavy stones of 40 or 50 pounds in weight to prevent escape, and then marched to the sea, sometimes hundreds of miles, with the weakly and sick dropping to die in the jungle. At the slave ports, they were penned into trunks for the inspection of the buyers. Thousands of human beings were packed in these trunks night and day, where the mortality rate was over 20%. On the ships the slaves were packed in, each given only 4 or 5 feet in length and 2 or 3 in height, so they could neither lie down at full length or sit upright. The revolts were incessant, so that the slaves had to be chained. When there was bad weather or rebellion, they would stay below in the ship for weeks at a time. To the slave traders, they were articles of trade, and no more. They undertook vast hunger strikes, and would hurl themselves at the crew in futile attempts at insurrection. To brighten their spirits, they would be brought up on the deck and forced to dance. Some took the opportunity to jump overboard. Fear of the cargo bred a savage cruelty in the crew. When the ship reached the harbor, the cargo came up on deck to be bought. The purchasers examined them, looked at the teeth, pinched the skin, sometimes tasted the perspiration. The purchaser spat in the face of the slave. Having become the property of the owner, he was branded on both sides of the breast with a hot iron. His duties were explained to him by an interpreter, and a priest instructed him in Christianity. Work began at daybreak, with a short breakfast break at 8 and a 2-hour break at midday, and went until evening, sometimes till 10 or 11. On the sugar plantations, the extraction of the juice and manufacture of the raw sugar went on for 3 weeks a month, 16 or 18 hours a day, for 7 or 8 months in the year. The slaves were housed like animals as well, in windowless huts with beaten earth floors and beds made of straw, hides, or cords tied on posts. They struggled with overwork and underfeeding. Louis XIV's Negro Code mandated they receive a certain amount of food, enough food in a week to last for 3 days. Instead, their masters gave them less than that. Worn out by their labors, many neglected to cook and ate the food raw. Even the 2 hours they were given in the middle of the day were not for rest, but for them to cultivate a small piece of land to supplement their rations. Their masters encouraged them in this, for in years of scarcity, the Africans died in thousands, epidemics broke out, and slaves fled into the woods. The difficulty was that they remained human beings. To make them docile took calculated brutality and terrorism. It is this that explains the unusual spectacle of property owners apparently careless of preserving their property. They had first to ensure their own safety. For the least fault, the slaves received the harshest punishment. In 1685, the Negro Code authorized whipping. The slaves received the whip with more certainty and regularity than they received their food. And more, irons on the hands and feet, blocks of wood to drag around, the iron collar, salt, pepper, cinders, and hot ashes and bleeding wounds, mutilations, pouring burning wax on arms, pouring boiling sugar cane over their heads, burning them alive, roasting them on slow fires, filling them with gunpowder and blowing them up with a match, tied down by ant and wasp nests, forced to eat their excrement and drink their urine. Evidence shows that these were normal features of slave life. Pregnant women were not spared. A hole would be dug in the ground to accommodate the unborn child so she could be whipped. If they were suspected of abortion, they would get an iron collar around the neck until they produced the child. The majority of the slaves accommodated themselves to this unceasing brutality by a profound fatalism. Wives and husbands, children and parents were separated at the will of the master, and a father and son would meet after many years and give no greeting or any sign of emotion. Suicide was common, and was often done in order to spite the owner. Death meant not only release, but a return to Africa. Poisonings were a common method by which slaves would get revenge on their masters or to manage their situation, for example, by poisoning the younger child of a master to ensure that there was only one heir, preventing preventing the plantation from being broken up and the gang dispersed. The planters, hating the slaves, called them unjust, cruel, barbarous, half human, treacherous, deceitful, thieves, drunkards, proud, lazy, unclean, shameless, jealous to fury, and cowards. In this way, they justified the abominable cruelties they practiced. And yet, a traveler named De Wimpfen observed, one has to hear with what warmth and what volubility, and at the same time with what precision of ideas and accuracy of judgment, this creature, heavy and taciturn all day, now squatting before his fire, tells stories, talks, gesticulates, argues, passes opinions, approves or condemns both his master and everyone who surrounds him. The latent possibilities in this intelligence frightened the colonists, as it frightens the whites in Africa today. At midnight celebrations of voodoo, they sang a song the words of which translate to, "We swear to destroy the whites and all that they possess. Let us die rather than fail to keep this vow." The colonists knew this song and tried to stamp it out, and the voodoo cult with which it was linked. In vain. There was a small privileged caste of slaves. They repaid their kind treatment and comparatively easy life with a strong attachment to their masters. But a few of these used their position to cultivate themselves, to gain a little education, to learn all they could. The leaders of a revolution are usually those who have been able to profit by the cultural advantages of the system they were attacking, and the San Domingo Revolution was no exception. Christophe, afterwards Emperor of Haiti, was a slave, a waiter in a public hotel. Toussaint L'Ouverture was also in this privileged caste. His father had been granted a certain liberty and 5 slaves of his own by his master. While the slaves spoke Creole, Toussaint learned to speak French. He was also made steward of all livestock on the estate. But this was not the norm, and not all submitted to the norm. Some flew to the woods and mountains to form bands of free men, Maroons. For 100 years before 1789, the Maroons were a danger to the colony. Periodically, they found a chief who was strong enough to unite the separate bands. The greatest of these chiefs was Mackandal. He conceived the bold design of uniting all the black people and driving the whites out of the colony. He was an orator who claimed to predict the future. He persuaded his followers that he was immortal, and exercised such a hold over them that they considered it an honor to serve him on their knees. An uninstructed mass, feeling its way to revolution, usually begins by terrorism. Mackandal and his organization spent 6 years poisoning not only whites but disobedient members of their own band. He planned to poison the water in every house in the capital of the province, and then launch an attack while the whites convulsed. Before this plan materialized, Mackandal went one day to a plantation, got drunk and was betrayed, and being captured was burnt alive. This was the only hint of an organized attempt at revolt during the 100 years preceding the French Revolution. White opinion at the beginning of the French Revolution dictated that all laws, however just and humane they may be, in favor of Negroes will always be a violation of the rights of property if they are not sponsored by the colonists. Not only planters but officials made it quite clear that whatever the penalties for the ill treatment of slaves, these could never be enforced. The slaves might understand that they had rights, which would be fatal to the peace and well being of the colony. The Negro Code was enacted in 1685, supposedly providing certain protections for slaves. A century after, in 1788, the Lejeune case laid bare the realities. Lejeune suspected that one slave of his had poisoned another, so he murdered 4 of his slaves and attempted to extort confessions from 2 women by torture. 14 slaves charged Lejeune before the law. The judges could do no less than accept the charges. An investigation confirmed the testimony of the slaves. When the 2 women died, Lejeune disappeared just in time to escape arrest. But white witnesses testified in his favor. The governor and the intendant wrote to the minister, "It seems that the safety of the colony depends on the acquittal of Lejeune." The judges, after 1,000 delays, returned a negative verdict. The charges were declared null and void, and the case dismissed. The home government could pass what laws it liked. White San Domingo would not tolerate any interference with the methods by which they kept their slaves in order. This was the problem to be solved. Hope from the planters there was none. Liberal writers in France railed against slavery, but ineffectually. But one literary opponent of slavery called for a slave revolution with passionate conviction. A priest, the Abbé Raynal. He wrote the philosophical and political history of the establishments and commerce of the Europeans in the 2 Indies. The book found its way into Toussaint L'Ouverture's hands. In the most famous passage, he wrote, "Already are there established 2 colonies of fugitive Negroes, whom treaties and power protect from assault. Those lightnings announce the thunder. A courageous chief only is wanted. Where is he, that great man whom nature owes to her vexed, oppressed, and tormented children? Where is he? He will appear, doubt it not. He will come forth and raise the sacred standards of liberty." Over and over again Toussaint read this passage. It is the tragedy of mass movements that they need and can only too rarely find adequate leadership. But much else was wanted. Men make their own history, and the Black Jacobins of San Domingo were to make history which would alter the fate of millions of men and shift the economic currents of 3 continents. But if they could seize opportunity, they could not create it. Slavery was woven tight into 18th century economics. 3 forces, the proprietors of San Domingo, the French bourgeoisie, and the British bourgeoisie, throve on this devastation of a continent and on the brutal exploitation of millions. As long as those maintained an equilibrium, the infernal traffic would go on. But nothing, however profitable, goes on forever. From the very momentum of their own development, the planters and bourgeois were generating internal stresses and intensifying external rivalries, moving blindly to explosions and conflicts which would shatter the basis of their domination and create the possibility of emancipation. Chapter 2: The Owners. The most important class of those thriving off of slavery were the San Domingo planters. They lived in a lush but monotonous island climate. The climate was harsh and could be intolerable, leading to fever and dysentery, cold, rheumatism, diarrhea. The planters had a disinclination for labor, used to having slaves perform any duty. Indulgence had the white colonial in its grip from childhood. The ignorance inherent in rural life prior to the Industrial Revolution was reinforced by the conceit of isolation allied to undisputed domination over hundreds of human beings. The plantations were often miles apart, and communication with neighbors was difficult and rare. The planters hated the life and sought only to make enough money to retire to France or at least spend a few months in Paris. In the early years of the colony, women had been imported like slaves and machinery. One official, unsatisfied with those sent, requested that the authorities not send the ugliest they could find in the hospitals. Town life is the nurse of civilization. But apart from Port au Prince, the capital, and Cap Francois, the towns were little more than villages. Even Cap Francois, or Le Cap as it was called, had a population of only 20,000, and half of those were slaves. Its harbor was always filled with ships, and its streets with merchandise, but the streets were sewers and people threw all their garbage into them. For culture, people read light novels, saw melodramas and thrillers at the theater, went to the gambling dens, dance halls, and the private brothels. The clergy were notorious for their degeneracy. In the towns, the great merchants and the wealthy agents of the maritime bourgeoisie were included with the planters as big whites. The managers and the stewards on the plantations, along with the town's small lawyers, notaries, clerks, artisans, and grocers, were known as the small whites. If a man had a bad reputation in his home country, he could come to San Domingo where his white skin made him a person of quality. Over both big and small whites was the bureaucracy, composed almost entirely of Frenchmen from France who governed the island. The heads of the bureaucracy were the governor and the intendant. They had the power to arrest without warrant, refuse the minister's instructions, force members of local advisory councils to resign, grant favors, increase taxes, and in general had no legal bounds. The colonists hated the bureaucracy. They treated the local whites with an arrogance that appalled these little monarchs with their 200 or 300 slaves. The chief complaint of the small whites was against the militia which policed the districts. In 1760, one intendant even dissolved the militia in response to these complaints. The home government had to respond by re-establishing the militia. Immediately, insurrection broke out on the island among the small whites. The planters complained that the supporters of this rebellion were the lowest sections of the population. Most of the small whites filled no important function in the local economy and were not an integral part of San Domingo society. Here, then, was the first great division between the big whites and small whites. Nothing could assuage or solve this conflict. The moment the revolution begins in France, these two will spring at each other and fight to a finish. There was another class of free men, the free mulattoes and free black people. In the early days, every mulatto was free up to the age of 24, but this was eventually done away with, and it was up to the individual father what happened with him. Many were freed, becoming artisans and household servants. They began to amass property, and the whites began to harass them with malicious legislation. They were made to join a police force to capture dangerous black people and fight against Maroons, and after 3 years' service, they had to join the local militia. They were excluded from many parts of life, could be harassed with impunity because any resistance would lead to lynching, never won legal battles, and any free man of color who struck a white man had his right arm cut off. But they did not have limits on how much property they could own. As they began to establish themselves, the white colonists were furious. They divided the offspring of white and black and intermediate shades into 128 divisions. The offspring with 127 white parts and one black part was still a man of color. But the mulattoes continued to make progress. They imitated the style of the whites and tried to get high commands in the militia. White San Domingo passed laws of maniacal savagery against them, proposing to banish them to the mountains, to forbid sale of property to them, to have them sell all their slaves within a year. The council wrote, "These are dangerous people. In a revolution, in a moment of tension, they would be the first to break the yoke which weighed on them." The advantages of being white were so obvious that race prejudice against the black people permeated the minds of the mulattoes, who so bitterly resented the same thing from the whites. Black slaves and mulattoes hated each other. Prosperity is not a moral question, and the justification of San Domingo was its prosperity. Never for centuries had the Western world known such economic progress. By 1754, there were 599 plantations of sugar and 3,379 of indigo. In 1767, it exported 72 million pounds of raw sugar and 51 million pounds of white sugar, a million pounds of indigo, and 2 million of cotton. If on no earthly spot was so much misery concentrated as on a slave ship, then on no portion of the globe did its surface in proportion to its dimensions yield so much wealth as the colony of San Domingo. And yet it was this very prosperity which would lead to the revolution. From the beginning, the colonists opposed the French government, who, like every government in those days, looked upon colonies as existing exclusively for the profit of the metropolis. Increases in fees or shortages in the supply of slaves sometimes led the colonists to revolt, at one point arresting the governor and putting him in prison, forcing the government to compromise. The colonists wished to shake off their shackles as Britain's American colonies were to shake off theirs. Thus, if big whites and small whites were in permanent conflict with each other, they were united against the mulattoes on the one hand and against the French bourgeoisie on the other. They could persecute the mulattoes, but against the French bourgeoisie they could do nothing but rage. The slave trade and slavery were the economic basis of the French Revolution. Nearly all the industries which developed in France during the 18th century had their origin either in goods or commodities destined for either the coast of Guinea or for America. Though the bourgeoisie traded in other things than slaves, upon the success or failure of the traffic, everything else depended. The cotton trade occupied the population of more than 100 French towns. The total value of the colonies was 3,000 millions, and 2 to 6 million Frenchmen depended on them for their livelihoods. The British bourgeois were the great rivals of the French. Between 1783 and 1789, San Domingo doubled its production. It was now incomparably the finest colony in the world. The British investigated and prepared a bombshell. Without slaves, San Domingo was doomed. The British colonies had enough slaves for all the trade they were ever likely to do. With the tears rolling down their cheeks for the poor suffering black people, those British bourgeois who had no West Indian interests set up a great howl for the abolition of the slave trade. The industrial bourgeois were beginning their victorious attack upon the agricultural monopoly. The West Indian sugar producers made an easy target. Figures like Adam Smith condemned the whole principle of slave labor as the most expensive in the world. Besides, the British could just get sugar from India. After the loss of America, India assumed a new importance. 50% of the slaves imported into the British islands were sold to the French colonies. It was the British slave trade that was putting the European market into French hands. The British found they were ruining things for themselves. This recognition led to action in the form of the formation of abolition societies, which then spread to France itself. These were the forces which, in the decade prior to the French Revolution, linked San Domingo to the economic destiny of three continents. Between 1764 and 1771, the average importation of slaves varied between 10 and 15,000. In 1786, it was 27,000, and from 1787 onward, the colony was taking more than 40,000 slaves a year. But economic prosperity is no guarantee of social stability. That rests on the constantly shifting equilibrium between the classes. This enormous increase of slaves was filling the colony with Africans who were resentful and ready for rebellion. Over time, there had been a gradual improvement in the treatment of the slaves, but this enormous number of newcomers who had to be broken and terrorized into labor and submission caused an increase in fear and severity. Meanwhile, by 1783, the colonists had gained more freedoms than previously under the French government. They wanted more. Mulattoes educated in Paris had come home, leading to more hatred and fear among the colonists and fiercer legislation against them. Forbidden to go any more to France, they stayed at home to increase the strength of the dissatisfied. It was the French bourgeoisie who pressed the button. A hard winter in 1788 brought matters to a head. The monarchy was bankrupt, the aristocracy sought its former power, the peasants began to revolt, and the bourgeoisie saw its chance to govern in collaboration with the radical aristocracy. While the French bourgeoisie led the assault on the absolute monarchy at home, the planters followed suit in the colonies. They sought representation under the revolutionary French States General. France admitted the principle of colonial representation. The slave owners claimed 18 seats, but were rebuffed on the grounds that they were counting slaves toward their population in order to inflate the number of seats when they did not treat their slaves as citizens. Instead of 18, they were allowed 6 deputies. In less than 5 minutes, the great liberal orator who had placed the case of the Friends of the Negro squarely before the whole of France in unforgettable words. The San Domingo representatives realized at last what they had done. They had tied the fortunes of San Domingo to the assembly of a people in revolution, and thenceforth the history of liberty in France and of slave emancipation in San Domingo is one and indivisible. One day in September, a boat sailed into the harbor, and the captain, hurrying ashore, ran down the streets of Le Cap, shouting the news of July 14th. The king had been preparing to disperse the Constituent Assembly by force, and the Paris masses, arming themselves, had stormed the Bastille as the symbol of feudal reaction. The Great French Revolution had begun. Chapter 3: Parliament and Property. The small whites, as soon as they heard of the fall of the Bastille, had deserted their friends the bureaucracy and joined the revolution. There was only one hope for the bureaucrats, the mulattoes, and the governor instructed the commandants of the districts to adopt a new attitude toward them, to not offend them, and to treat them as friends and whites. The plan succeeded, and the mulattoes everywhere supported the royalist bureaucracy and militia. Meanwhile, the politicians leading the revolution in San Domingo and the propertyless small whites wanted to exterminate the mulattoes and confiscate their property. In Paris, the Count Charles de Lameth proclaimed, "I would prefer to lose all I possess in San Domingo than violate the principles that justice and humanity have consecrated," and declared himself for political rights for mulattoes and the abolition of slavery. Though Lameth was a right-wing liberal who would show himself not committed to the cause, his words drove white San Domingo to fury. They began to terrorize the mulattoes. Mulattoes claiming rights for their people were lynched. Leaders in this terror were the small whites. Some mulattoes issued a call for insurrection across the island. The whites summoned all their forces, and the rising petered out. But at this, the richer planters were thoroughly frightened. The planters were becoming nervous of the behavior of the small whites, who were eager to use the revolution to become officials and masters. The planters began to look for compromise with the rich mulattoes. God had undoubtedly made the black blood inferior to the white, and the bureaucracy was a burden, but these owners of hundreds of slaves were already prepared to turn a blind eye to these century-old tenets of their caste in face of the dangers they saw ahead. San Domingo had 3 white parties in relation to the French Revolution: the royalist bureaucracy, in other words, the counter-revolution, the Assembly of Saint Mark, who called themselves the Patriots, and the Provincial Assembly of the North, who for the time being supported the government as the link with France. All 3 despised the mulattoes, but all 3 needed them. In Paris, the taking of the Bastille on July 14th not only intimidated the king, but frightened the bourgeoisie, who hastened to form a national guard, strictly excluding the poor. Hastening to profit from the blow to the monarchy, they drew up the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Shortly after, the mulattoes claimed the rights of man to apply to themselves as well. The bourgeoisie did not know what to say. The colonists in Paris would have none of it. They threatened the bourgeoisie with the specter of a slave revolt on the one hand, and their own independence on the other. The maritime bourgeoisie went red in the face and put the rights of man in their pockets whenever the colonial question came up. But the bourgeoisie was not homogeneous, and the radical wing espoused the cause of the mulattoes. The assembly split into two. On the right were the colonial deputies, the agents of the colonists, and the representatives of the maritime bourgeois. Not for the last time in history, the counter-revolution and everything wealthy in the revolution found common ground on the colonial question. On the other side were the radicals, humanitarians and philosophers, the intellectuals of the day, led by the Friends of the Negro. They proposed rights to mulattoes and gradual abolition of slavery. Ultimately, their efforts were half-hearted, and for the most part, everybody conspired to forget the slaves. The Assembly appointed a commission to look into the mulatto question, chaired by Barnave, who issued a decree declaring guilty of crime against the nation whoever tried to excite opposition to any branch of commerce with the colonies, direct or indirect. This was an instruction for all talk on abolition of the slave trade to cease. In San Domingo, the mulattoes, who were rejected in France and humiliated at home, organized a revolt. It was the quarrel between the bourgeoisie and monarchy that brought the Paris masses on the political stage. It was the quarrel between whites and mulattoes that woke the sleeping slaves. In France, the big bourgeoisie was quite finished with the revolution. The Constitution divided the masses based on who had property and who did not. Associations of the masses were abolished, and the National Guard carried out a stern policing of Paris. The masses were chained and muzzled, and without the masses, the radical Democrats were merely voices. But following the execution of a mulatto leader who had launched an attack on the Cap in San Domingo, a debate was held on the colonial question in Paris. Robespierre declared, over violent interruptions, "You urge without ceasing the rights of man, but you believe in them so little yourselves that you have sanctified slavery constitutionally. Perish the colonies, if the price is to be your happiness, your glory, your liberty. We will sacrifice to the colonial deputies neither the nation, nor the colonies, nor the whole of humanity." It was magnificent, but it was not abolition. It was only the word slavery Robespierre was objecting to, not the thing. After much discussion, a compromise was proposed. Every mulatto whose parents were both free should have the vote. There were only 400 of these, but it seemed a way out. The compromise carried by an overwhelming majority. And once a single colored man had got his rights, the victory of the rest was only a matter of work and time. Reaction triumphed in the French Revolution. And meanwhile, what of the slaves? They had heard of the revolution and had construed it in their own image. The white slaves in France had risen and killed their masters and were now enjoying the fruits of the earth. It was gravely inaccurate, in fact, but they had caught the spirit of the thing. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Before the end of 1789, there were risings in Guadeloupe and Martinique. On San Domingo, there were movements in isolated plantations. All were bloodily repressed. Revolutionary literature was circulating among them. In March 1791, French soldiers landing at Port-au-Prince told mulattoes, and all Negroes that the Assembly in France had declared all men free and equal. In the area, many Negroes were seizing arms and rebelling. At one spot, they came out with such force and determination, the police force and all proprietors in the neighborhood were needed to suppress them. Neglected and ignored by all the politicians of every brand and persuasion, they had organized on their own and struck for freedom at last. Chapter 4. The San Domingo masses began. By hard experience, the slaves learned that isolated efforts were doomed to failure, and in the early months of 1791, they were organizing for revolution. Voodoo was the medium of the conspiracy. Boukman was the leader. The plan was to set fire to the plantations around Le Cap, massacre the whites in the town, and then slaves on the plain would complete the destruction, taking the colony for themselves. The slaves destroyed tirelessly. They were seeking their salvation in the most obvious way. The destruction of what they knew was the cause of their sufferings. And yet they were surprisingly moderate. The cruelties of property and privilege are always more ferocious than the revenges of poverty and oppression. For the one aims at perpetuating resented injustice, the other is merely a momentary passion soon appeased. As usual, the strength of the mass movement dragged in its wake revolutionary sections of those classes nearest to it. Free blacks joined them. When they saw the slaves taking action on such a grand scale, the young mulattoes from the Cap and nearby rushed to join the hitherto despised blacks and fight against the common enemy. After a few weeks, they stopped for a moment to organize themselves. At this period, 1 month after the revolt had begun, Toussaint L'Ouverture joined them. Like so many men of better education than the rank and file, he lacked their boldness at the moment of action and waited to see how things would go. Meanwhile, hating destruction, he kept his master's slaves in order and prevented the revolutionary laborers from setting fire to the plantation. He was 45 years old, had had exceptional opportunities, and had none of the dullness or degradation characteristic of slavery. His post as steward of the livestock had given him experience in administration, authority, and intercourse with those who ran the plantation. He had read Caesar's commentaries and learned about politics and military art from them. He had read about the economics and politics of not only San Domingo, but all the great European empires engaged in colonial expansion and trade. His orderly mind was revolted at the spectacle the slave camp presented. Many men were naked, others wore filthy rags. Their weapons were a few seized guns and pistols, agricultural implements, sticks pointed with iron, and anything they could get their hands on. They were divided into two large bands, one under Biassou, the other under Jean Francois. When one leader drank the blood of the white victims, Jean Francois arrested him and had him shot, a conspicuous difference between their behavior and that of the white colonists. The slaves had revolted because they wanted to be free, but no ruling class ever admits such things. The white cockades accused the patriots and the friends of the Negro of stirring up the revolt, while the red cockades accused the royalists and the counter-revolution in France. The small whites accused the mulattoes and massacred them at sight in the streets. Groups of whites massacred all slaves they met, even on plantations where they had not yet revolted. A mulatto uprising in the West began. They were a formidable force. For this reason, the royalist counter-revolution sought to make use of them. They agreed to create a united front against the municipality of Port-au-Prince and the Provincial Assembly of the West. Mulattoes and whites had a meeting at which mulattoes presented a draft of their demands for complete equality, threatening civil war if they were not met. The whites accepted their demands immediately. A great ceremony of reconciliation took place in Port-au-Prince, with white and mulatto leaders marching arm in arm. But in the Cap, the assembly foamed with wrath at these goings-on in the West. They promised to give the mulattoes their rights, but after the troubles were over. With tensions high, one black person who was part of a mulatto force was hanged, and the mulattoes seemed to go mad. Penchinat issued a ringing call for battle. In the South, efforts at unity between mulattoes and whites were broken, and they began fighting. This was the San Domingo that the three commissioners, Saint Leger, Mirbec, and Room, were to restore to order when they landed at Le Cap on November 29th, 1791. After 4 months of insurrection, the black leaders had come to a dead end. The former slaves could devastate the country around, but that very devastation was making it impossible for them to exist. Famine began to kill them off. Jean-Francois and Biassou offered peace to the commissioners in return for the liberty of a few hundred leaders. Political treachery is not a monopoly of the white race, and this abominable betrayal so soon after the insurrections shows that political leadership is a matter of program, strategy, and tactics, and not the color of those who lead it, their oneness of origin with their people, nor the services they have rendered. The high and mighty colonists refused. They answered that they would grant pardon only to repentant criminals who returned to work. Jean-Francois begged that for the freedom of 400 leaders and forgetfulness of the past, he would lead the black people back to slavery. The commissioners asked him to return the white prisoners. He agreed. After a delegate of black leaders met with the colonial assembly and received no respect, Toussaint came to an unalterable decision from which he never wavered and for which he died. Complete liberty for all, to be attained and held by their own strength. The most extreme revolutionaries are formed by circumstances. On his return, he told his chiefs not to look at the commissioners for anything. Henceforth it was war, and war needed trained soldiers. The first thing that frightened Paris was the way the news of the insurrection reached them. They heard of it from an English paper. The first question was for troops to quell the revolt. But in a revolution, the revolution comes first. The king was still head of the army and navy. To put an army and a fleet into his hands would be putting weapons into hands that might use it against the revolution itself. On March 24th, the legislative in Paris passed a decree giving full political rights to mulattoes. The king's signature made the decree law, but they would not touch property, and the slaves were property. The friends of the Negro, good liberals, were now in power and were as silent about slavery as any colonist. In San Domingo, Toussaint had 500 troops. These, and not the decisions of the legislative, would be decisive in the struggle for freedom. Revolutionaries in Paris, whites and mulattoes in San Domingo, were still looking upon the slave revolt as a huge riot which would be put down in time once the division between the slave owners was closed. Chapter 5 And the Paris Masses Complete. 6,000 men sailed from France to suppress the Black Revolt. Before they reached San Domingo, the Paris masses had taken matters into their own hands and dragged the Bourbons off the throne. To escape from the demands of the peasants, like a maximum price for food, the Girondins plunged the country into war with Austria. The Girondins, who feared the Paris masses more than the counter-revolution, would not take steps against the royalists, and the people of Paris stormed the Tuileries on August 10th, imprisoning the royal family, dissolving the legislative, and summoning a new parliament called the National Convention. What has all this to do with the slaves? Everything. The workers and peasants of France were striking at royalty, tyranny, reaction, and oppression of all types, and with these they included slavery. Henceforth, the Paris masses were for abolition, and their black brothers in San Domingo, for the first time, had passionate allies in France. The slaves in San Domingo, by their insurrection, had shown revolutionary France that they could fight and die for freedom. But it takes organization and time to translate mass feeling into action, and for the moment, the revolution had more urgent matters than slavery to deal with. Early in October, San Domingo heard the news of August 10th, the bid of the Paris masses for power not with speeches but with arms. The situation in San Domingo showed the first sign of a thoroughly ill-adjusted or bankrupt form of society, which is that the ruling classes cannot agree how to save the situation. This division opens the breach, and the ruling classes will continue to fight with each other as long as they do not fear the mass seizure of power. But the insurrection now seemed at its last gasp. Lavaux, the French commander, defeated Toussaint. Candy, who led a band of mulattoes, had deserted the black people and joined the commissioners. The revolution had overflowed the boundaries of France. On January 21st, 1793, the king was executed. In February came war with Spain, then with Britain, and Lavaux was recalled to fortify the coast against these enemies. The French Revolution, being still in the hands of liberals and moderates, was clearly bent on driving the black people back to the old slavery. Thus, when the Spaniards in San Domingo offered the black people an alliance against the French government, naturally they accepted. Here were white men offering them guns and ammunition and supplies, recognizing them as soldiers, treating them as equals, and asking them to shoot other whites. Toussaint joined the Spaniards as well, but continued boldly to rally the black people on the slogan of liberty for all. Sonthonax ruled on behalf of the revolution in San Domingo. When Galbaud was appointed governor from France, the Lecat whites who were for counter-revolution gave him a warm welcome. Sonthonax, taking heed of this development, dismissed Galbaud and put him and his staff on a vessel to be taken back to France. But Galbaud would not leave without a fight, joined by the whites of the counter-revolution, and they drove the commissioners and their forces out of the city. Sonthonax gave orders that the slaves and prisoners of Lecat should be armed and unloose the lot at Galbaud and the whites. In the fighting, fire broke out and burned two-thirds of the city to the ground, destroying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property. 10,000 refugees crowded into the harbor and set out for the U.S., the majority of them never to return. It was the end of white domination in San Domingo. That is how white San Domingo destroyed itself. The struggle of classes ends either in the reconstruction of society or in the common ruin of the contending classes. The French Revolution laid the basis for modern France, but so corrupt and rotten was the slave society of San Domingo that it could not stand any strain and perished as it deserved to perish. To Sonthonax's surprise, the slaves he had armed did not stay with the commissioners. They gathered up their plunder and went back to their roving life in the hills and their Spanish allies. The royalist officers were leaving Sonthonax for the Spaniards, and the slaves who had not yet revolted, kindled by the revolutionary ferment around them, refused to be slaves any longer. The white slave owners who remained in San Domingo had learned much in the last 2 years. One of them, who owned hundreds of slaves, told Sonthonax that it would be best to declare abolition. He did so on August 29th, 1793. It was his last card, and he could not help himself. Though those freed by Sonthonax remained always faithful to him, the black soldiers and their leaders remained in alliance with the Spaniards. Meanwhile, mulatto armies had taken Port-au-Prince. When the fighting was over, they chose some of the bravest slaves and offered them freedom if they would lead the rest back to slavery and keep them in order. The offer was accepted, and 100,000 slaves were led back to their plantations, the inevitable fate of any class which allows itself to be led by another. Many of the mulatto proprietors in the West, though having the government in their hands, were furious at the decree of abolition and abandoned the revolution to which they owed so much. Many deserting royalist officers joined Toussaint's band. From them he learnt the orthodox military art, used them to train his troops, and organized an efficient staff. His forces grew, and he took Dondon and Ennery. The abolition of slavery had weakened the morale of the Republican commanders, and between joining the counter-revolution under Toussaint and being massacred by his forces, the choice was easy, especially because he had a great reputation for humanity, uncommon at the time. But Toussaint knew where his real power lay and continued to call the black people to freedom. And while he performed his miracles in the north, the British added to the complications by making an armed bid for San Domingo. The British had long harbored interest in San Domingo, but was hesitant to go for it because it would mean war with France. But now they saw an opportunity to ally with Spain and keep France and America out of the West Indies. British rule would reestablish the old regime, slavery, mulatto discrimination, and all. All propertied San Domingo, mulattoes included, rushed to welcome the British, the defenders of slavery. With such a welcome, nothing could stop the British. By the beginning of 1794, they held a great amount of territory in San Domingo. It was a crucial moment in world history. If the British could hold San Domingo, the finest colony in the world, they would once more be a power in American waters. Instead of being abolitionists, they would be the most powerful practitioners and advocates of the slave trade on a scale excelling anything they had ever done before. But there was another more urgent issue. If the British completed the conquest of San Domingo, the colonial empire of revolutionary France was gone. Its vast resources would be directed into British pockets, and Britain would be able to return to Europe and throw army and navy against the revolution. Britain captured the capital of Port au Prince. Toussaint watched as his hope was wrecked by the British victories. In Paris, the masses gave their support to Robespierre on the extreme left. They made the Girondin leaders retire from the convention, placed them only under house arrest, and offered hostages out of their own ranks as guarantees for their safety. When history is written as it ought to be written, it is the moderation and long patience of the masses at which men will wonder, not their ferocity. The convention under Robespierre finally abolished the feudal laws, where to this day reaction can only see a few thousand people who fell under the guillotine. Paris between March 1793 and July 1794 was one of the supreme epochs of political history. A black man named Bellet addressed the convention with a fiery speech asking they declare slavery abolished. A decree was issued. The National Convention declares slavery abolished in all the colonies. In consequence, it declares that all men, without distinction of color, domiciled in the colonies, are French citizens and enjoy all the rights assured under the Constitution. Now that Sonthenac's decree of abolition was ratified in France, Toussaint at once told Lavaux that he was willing to join him. All his troops came with him. Then, in a campaign as brilliant as the one by which he had captured the line of camps for the Spaniards, he recaptured them for the French and began driving back the British. Chapter 6: The Rise of Toussaint. Although few recognized it fully at the time, Toussaint and the black people were henceforth the decisive factors in the revolution. The black laborers, so recently slaves, and the loyal mulattoes, led by their own officers, inflicted on Britain the severest defeat that has befallen a British expeditionary force between the days of Elizabeth and the Great War. Lavaux was now in sole charge of the colony. Toussaint's army was majority Africans born out of the colony. The chief officers were also, like Toussaint himself, ex slaves. There were Dessalines, Christophe, his brother Paul Louverture, and Moise, who Toussaint had adopted as a child. Toussaint lived with the men and charged at their head. All knew him from the few months before when he was merely old Toussaint. He shared all their toils and dangers, but his most trusted officers feared rather than loved him. The troops were often without food and had to go looking for sugarcane. The British and Spaniards tried to take advantage of this situation, offering Toussaint's men arms and pay if they switched sides, but there is no record of them having any notable success. The morale of the Revolutionary Army was too high. Toussaint had the advantage of liberty and equality, the slogans of the Revolution. The masses were the foundation of Toussaint's army. Just out of the degradation of slavery, they had come into a world of indiscriminate murder and violence. Little wonder that the black laborers were in a constant state of insurrection. Toussaint was an autocrat, but felt deep and passionate sympathy for them. At the first hint of insurrection, he would go himself. He would give an address on the way they should conduct themselves, not redressing their grievances through assassination. Next day, he calls a meeting of all the black people in the district. He makes them swear to work hard and be obedient. He appoints a commander. They danced and cheered for him. But not all groups were receptive to these interventions. One group shot him in the leg in response. The black laborers felt immense pride at being citizens of the French Republic. Toussaint always addressed them as French citizens. In response, the British and Spaniards could only offer money, and there are periods in human history when money is not enough. Toussaint saw early that political power is only a means to an end. The salvation of San Domingo lay in the restoration of agriculture. He held work as a necessity, a virtue, and for the general good of the state, and imposed harsh regulations. He authorized the military to keep the laborers on the plantations, implementing forced labor and restraint of movement. He retained the confidence of the laborers because he insisted that wages be paid, and he was equally stern with the white proprietors. Toussaint knew that the owners of property had no principles, but they had the knowledge, education, and experience which the colony needed if it was to be restored to prosperity. The whites wanted their plantations, and he gave them over, always ready to forget their treachery if they would work the land. He appointed whites to government posts, and they grew to recognize that he could be depended upon to protect them from the laborers ready to massacre them. In administration, Toussaint made himself into a whole cabinet like a fascist dictator, except that he actually did the work. In the early months of 1796, all San Domingo knew that Toussaint L'Ouverture, the black general, stood first in the counsels and affection of the governor. Chapter 7. The Mulattoes Try and Fail. Eminence engenders enemies. The white revolutionary royalists had long ago marked down Toussaint as enemy number one, but the whites were no longer a force in San Domingo. The potential rulers were the mulattoes, who saw Toussaint's growing reputation as a threat to the domination they considered theirs by right. The mulatto proprietors remained uneasily pro British. When Toussaint captured an area, they would take an oath of allegiance to the French Republic, but then, behind Toussaint's back, they would plot to get the British back, causing Toussaint to lose many of his most important captures. Toussaint recognized this dynamic. This was no question of color, but crudely a question of class, for those black people who were formerly free stuck to the mulattoes. Persons of some substance and standing under the old regime, they looked upon the ex slaves as essentially persons to be governed. The mulattoes felt they could govern the country, and some of the local whites conspired with them. In Le Cap, many mulattoes were living without paying rent in houses deserted by former owners. When a treasurer made them pay, they raised the cry of tyranny. Things were coming to a head. One morning, a group of 6 or 8 rushed into Governor Laveau's bedroom and began beating him. The group of mulattoes dragged the governor to prison. But Toussaint had eyes on the situation and had armed laborers march in the prison. The black masses ran through the streets of the town, crying, "Power to the law!" Laveau, to the astonishment of all, and the unbounded joy of the black people, proclaimed Toussaint assistant to the governor and swore that he would never do anything without consulting him. France, still engaged in a life and death struggle in Europe, was leaning on the black people, not only against the British, but against the threat of mulatto independence. Thus, the stock of Toussaint as leader of the black people was rising steadily. Chapter 8. The White Slave Owners Again. Sonthonax, a white man from France who had been sent as part of a government commission in response to the mulatto aspirations of rule, began a pronounced pro-black policy. He abolished restraint for debt and put at liberty all those in prison for this offense. He worked to instill the necessity of labor in everyone, but stood firmly against coercion and forbade beating on the plantations. He prioritized their education, and the black masses were willing to learn from white men like Sonthonax. All they asked was to be rid forever of the fear of slavery. But they knew the British, as well as their old owners, would make them slaves again at the first opportunity, and their hope was in Toussaint. Toussaint wanted to become commander in chief, and with delicacy he suggested to Laveau that he could help him get back to France if he wished. In the France of 1794, Robespierre still held power, but now he had gone far enough and lagged behind the revolutionary masses. In this phase of the Terror, far more working men than aristocrats perished. Robespierre destroyed his own left wing and thereby sealed his own doom. The tragedy was that the Paris masses, in leaving him to this fate, were opening the door to worse enemies. Robespierre's successors were the financial speculators, buyers of church property, the new bourgeoisie. They were enemies of royalty, but were determined to keep the masses in their place and were willing to ally with the old bourgeoisie and even some of the aristocracy. When the masses grasped the situation, they tried to reassert their old power, but the new bourgeois France was too strong for them. As reaction increased, the old slave owners, crawling out of their prisons and hiding places, held up their heads again and clamored for order to be restored in San Domingo and the colonies. In San Domingo, the black people could deal with the local whites who hinted at any return to slavery. But now, as they heard what was happening in France, their doubts grew, and they began to ask all strangers arriving in the colony from France if the Republic was sincere in giving them liberty. Sonthonax, who had been sent from France originally to prevent mulatto rule, intended to arrest mulatto leader Panchina, who was the idol of the South and of mulattoes all over the colony. Meanwhile, government commissioners stirred up laborers against Rigaud's government, telling them that the mulattoes were oppressing them. This tension led to insurrection among the mulattoes, which was calmed when Rigaud issued a proclamation stating that he had officially been put in control of the government. A breach was created between the south of San Domingo, led by Rigaud, and the colony, as led by the French government. Under these conditions, the mulattoes, repelled by the Republic, drew nearer to the black masses under Toussaint. Toussaint was gradually becoming the one man in San Domingo on whom everything hinged. Toussaint was appointed commander-in-chief and governor on the recommendation of Sonthonax, who installed him in Le Cap with an imposing ceremony. Afterward, in a strange turn of events, Toussaint began demanding that Sonthonax leave for France. Sonthonax did go, though he was shocked. What was behind this extraordinary episode? An unsolved enigma to this day. Toussaint's explanation was that Sonthonax had continuously suggested to him a plan to massacre the whites and declare the colony independent. How much truth was there in this explanation? Nobody knows for certain. The most plausible explanation for Toussaint's actions involves events occurring in Paris rather than San Domingo. In Paris, Sonthonax's pro-black legislation was driving certain reactionary elements wild. These demanded he be recalled, and the motion carried. Toussaint could see exactly where the steady growing reaction would end. He himself would lose his head, and the colony would be ultimately restored to slavery. To prevent this fate, he threw Sonthonax to the wolves. From this point, the French government suspected Toussaint of a design to make the colony independent, and Toussaint feared the intention of the French to restore slavery. He envisaged the necessity of holding on to power even at the cost of defying France. In the end, Toussaint accomplished what he did because he incarnated the determination of his people never, never to be slaves again. Chapter 9: The Expulsion of the British. Toussaint, in undisputed command, prepared to sweep the British completely out of San Domingo. In Britain, the government was taking stock of the huge losses they'd suffered in the West Indies and were choosing to withdraw many of their troops. Toussaint did not know this, however, and planned and executed a military campaign, winning 7 victories in 7 days. After Sonthonax was recalled, France appointed General Hédouville as their agent in San Domingo. There was alarm that Toussaint had deposed Sonthonax. Hédouville was instructed to do all he could to check Toussaint's power until France could send troops. In the midst of a British attack on Rigaud in the south, Hédouville held a meeting with Rigaud. What happened at this interview is one of the great tragedies of San Domingo. Hédouville convinced Rigaud that he would get great rewards if he helped remove supreme power from Toussaint L'Ouverture. Rigaud seized the chance to put himself right with France, and ruined himself, his caste, and his country for a generation. Between the French bourgeoisie and the black laborers, the mulattoes wavered continuously. The pity was that Rigaud had not the sense to see that the French would use him against Toussaint and then inevitably turn on him. Meanwhile, negotiating with the British, Toussaint threatened to send people to Jamaica and incite the black laborers there to revolt. The British knew they could not conquer Toussaint, and so they must conciliate him. Soon the British offered to evacuate San Domingo completely, and Toussaint accepted. But they then went behind Toussaint's back and tried to secretly negotiate with Hédouville. When Hédouville played along, Toussaint reproached him for acting out of turn, and Hédouville was defensive in response. Maitland of the British saw an opportunity to weaken France, Britain's rival, by ensuring that Toussaint was so strong he could defeat the French in eventual battle. He invited Toussaint to an interview and proposed to him to make the island independent and have Toussaint be the king, assuring him of British protection. Toussaint refused, and this is the measure of the difference between himself and Rigaud. He knew when Britain had the opportunity, they would overthrow him and restore slavery. To all the black people, revolutionary France, which had decreed equality and the abolition of slavery, was a beacon among the nations. France was to them, indeed, the mother country. Toussaint did not want to break with France to join the slave holding British. He would be faithful to France as long as France was faithful to the black people. In the end, Toussaint outmaneuvered the British. Their defeat in San Domingo prevented their checking of the French Revolution in Europe. Rumors began to spread that the new agent Hédouville was hostile to Toussaint, and whoever was hostile to Toussaint was hostile to black people. And yet it is curious and characteristic of Toussaint that the most bitter subject of quarrel was the emigrant whites, with Toussaint, the ex-slave, taking their side, and Hédouville, a former nobleman, attacking Toussaint for protecting them. Toussaint was willing to invite any of them back who took the oath of fidelity. Hédouville accused him of protecting enemies of the Republic. This conflict led to Toussaint resigning his post as commander-in-chief. Unrest spread in San Domingo. Hédouville tried to introduce a system of apprenticeship of the laborers to the owners for periods of 6 and 9 years. The black laborers might have taken this from Toussaint or Sonthonax, but not from Hédouville. Fears for black liberty began to grow. Hédouville began disbanding black troops and setting up only white troops to protect the coasts. This was looked at with intense suspicion. But when Hédouville dismissed Moise and ordered him to be captured dead or alive, Toussaint gave Dessalines orders to march on the Cap and arrest Hédouville. Hédouville was driven off of the island and returned to France. The next day, in a public speech, Toussaint boldly asserted his own authority, saying, "Remember that there is only one Toussaint L'Ouverture in San Domingo, and that at his name everybody must tremble." Back in Paris, Hédouville informed the Directory that the colony was practically lost to France, and there was only one chance of saving it, deepening the divisions between the black laborers and the mulattoes. Hédouville and Maitland were the same kind of man. Though they were among the very leaders of their society, they were nevertheless the very dregs of human civilization and moral standards. A historian who finds excuses for such conduct by references to the supposed spirit of the times, or by omission, or by silence, shows thereby that his account of events is not to be trusted. Hédouville and Maitland had their reasons. So have their counterparts of today. They fill our newspapers and radios. The type is always with us, and so are their defenders. Chapter 10: Toussaint seizes the power. What Toussaint had to do now was to crush the mulatto state of Rigaud. The great danger now was a French expedition, and it was suicidal to allow Rigaud and his mulattoes to remain in control of the south and west. They would most certainly welcome a French force and ensure the ruin of the Black State. Rigaud sent in his resignation to Toussaint. Rome refused to accept Rigaud's resignation, and thenceforth civil war was inevitable. Meanwhile, in December of 1798, an article appeared in the London Gazette declaring San Domingo independent. The British, after having been driven out of the island in September, were posing now as the authors of the Happy Revolution and rejoicing at the freedom of a people to enslave whom they had just lost 100,000 men. Having thus driven another wedge between Toussaint and the French, Maitland then set out for America to negotiate the division of the trade with that country. But there, he found that Toussaint was already negotiating with the Americans. When they realized how advanced these negotiations already were, the British threatened Toussaint that if their ships were not allowed in the San Domingo harbors on the same terms as the Americans, then British crusaders would blockade the island. The San Domingo economy was on the verge of collapse, and Toussaint had to admit British ships flying the American or Spanish flag into the harbors. Next, he once more took the offensive against Rigaud. Rigaud won the first victory, but overall he was at his worst in this crucial campaign. When he hesitated and looked to France for help, Toussaint looked to France for nothing. Sending Dessalines to the south, he traveled north to crush the revolts. Napoleon Bonaparte, victorious in the internal struggle of the bourgeoisie for power, was still too busy in Europe to deal with San Domingo. He did send a new commission to the island. Upon their arrival, all over the colony, black people and mulattoes were saying that the Civil War had been kindled by the whites to weaken both sides and restore slavery. Bonaparte also addressed a letter to the citizens of San Domingo saying that from now on the colony would be governed by special laws and asked them to inscribe on their army flags a statement that they owed all their liberty to France. This letter confirmed Toussaint's worst suspicions, and he refused to make the inscription on the banner. Rigaud, having lost the confidence of his followers, left the island and set sail for France. In the years of its history as an independent state, the mulattoes and black people of San Domingo have fought the unceasing struggle of the classes, sometimes rising to civil war, as is common to all societies, whether homogeneous in color or not. But at the slightest threat of foreign invasion, they have always presented a solid front to the enemy. This lesson they were to learn by hard experience. The fatal error was Rigaud's. With victory, by August 1800, Toussaint had only half solved his problem. The officials in the South were still mainly mulatto. To leave them as they were, after the bitterness of the Civil War, meant that if a French expedition landed, they would welcome it even more eagerly than when under Rigaud. The task of pacification fell, unfortunately, to Dessalines. He could not trust the army that Rigaud had made, which was as loyal to Rigaud as his own army was to him. Toussaint commanded Dessalines to purge the troops. 350 prisoners were shot. Toussaint had to put a stop to it. I said to prune the tree, not to uproot it. A great bitterness against Toussaint and Dessalines smoldered in the hearts of the mulattoes in the South. Toussaint knew what he had done and the danger, but he could not help it. At all costs, he had to have an army in the South on which he could depend when a French expedition landed. With the South under control, the next danger spot to be safeguarded was Spanish San Domingo. Bonaparte had expressly forbidden Toussaint to annex that colony. Toussaint would then be master of the whole island. But this was exactly why Toussaint was going to take it. He was not going to leave his flank exposed to the French expedition. Overcoming with force the opposition of Commissioner Room to the taking of the Spanish territory, Toussaint marched on Spanish San Domingo, routed their troops, and on January 21st, 1800, the Spanish governor formally handed over the colony. He was now complete master of the whole island, a territory nearly as large as Ireland, and he had become so in less than 10 years. But there was still Bonaparte with his special laws. Toussaint wrote to Bonaparte asking for approval of what he had done. This was defiance. But, too confident in his powers, he was making one dreadful mistake. Not with Bonaparte, nor with the French government. In nothing does his genius stand out so much as in refusing to trust the liberties of the black people to the promises of French or British imperialism. His error was his neglect of his own people. They did not understand what he was doing or where he was going. He took no trouble to explain. It was dangerous to explain, but still more dangerous not to explain. The masses thought he had taken Spanish San Domingo to stop the slave traffic, and not as a safeguard against the French. Dessalines did not share Toussaint's scruples. After the war with Rigaud, Dessalines told his soldiers, "The war you have just won is a little war, but you have two more, bigger ones. One is against the Spaniards, who do not want to give up their land and who have insulted your brave commander in chief. The other is against France, who will try to make you slaves again as soon as she has finished with her enemies. We'll win those wars." That was and still is the way to speak to the masses, and it is no accident that Dessalines, and not Toussaint, finally led the island to independence. Chapter 11. The Black Consul. So long as the war lasted between France and Britain, Toussaint was safe. But peace might come at any moment now, and with the peace would come Bonaparte's special laws. The colony was devastated by 12 years of civil and foreign war. Of the 30,000 whites in the colony in 1789, only 10,000 remained. The rest had been killed or had emigrated. Of the 40,000 free mulattoes and free black people, there were still about 30,000, while of the 500,000 slaves, perhaps one third had perished. Plantations and cultivation had been destroyed far and wide. For nearly 10 years, the population, corrupt enough before, had been trained in bloodshed and soaked in violence. Bands of marauders roamed the countryside. The only disciplined force was the army, and Toussaint instituted a military dictatorship. The ultimate guarantee of freedom was the prosperity of agriculture. This was Toussaint's slogan. He was battling with the colossal task of transforming a slave population into a community of free laborers. Not allowing the old estates to be broken up, he instead ensured that the laborers working with them were given their keep as well as a fourth of the produce. This alone was sufficient to mark the change from the old to the new despotism. The new order was vastly different from the old. The black laborers were free, and though there might be dissatisfaction with the new regime, there was no regret for the old. They used to work from dawn until late in the night. Now they worked from 5 to 5. No employer dared to beat them. Any regime which tolerated such practices was doomed, for the revolution had created a new race of men. At bottom, the popular movements had acquired an immense self confidence. The former slaves had defeated white colonists, Spaniards, and British, and now they were free. There was no need to be ashamed of being black. The revolution had awakened them, had given them the possibility of achievement, confidence, and pride. That psychological weakness, that feeling of inferiority with which the imperialists poisoned colonial peoples everywhere, these were gone. Toussaint reorganized the administration with boldness and skill. He restructured the tax system and organized a maritime police to deal with contraband. Spanish San Domingo presented a problem. The Spaniards hated Toussaint. He practiced conciliation toward them and focused on improving the territory's infrastructure and inviting people to settle there. He established schools and encouraged the practice of the Catholic religion. He insisted on moral principles, the necessity for work, respect for law and order, pride in San Domingo, veneration for France. He sought to lift the people to some understanding of the duties and responsibilities of freedom and citizenship. It was the propaganda of a dictatorship, but not for base personal ends or the narrow interests of one class oppressing another. His government balanced between the classes, but was rooted in the preservation of the interests of the laboring poor. No doubt the poor sweated, and were backward so that the new ruling class might thrive, but at least they too were better off than they had been. The success of Toussaint's administration can be judged by the fact that in a year and a half he had restored cultivation to two-thirds of what it had been in the most flourishing days of the old regime. The inspection of agriculture,
commerce, fortifications, municipalities, schools, the distribution of prizes to successful scholars. Toussaint was tireless in performing these duties all across the country, and none knew when and where the governor would appear. He deliberately cultivated this mysteriousness, and after these lightning dashes across the country, he would go into his cabinet and dictate hundreds of letters until far in the early morning. From the beginning to the end of his career, he charged at the head of his men whenever a supreme effort was required. He seemed to bear a charmed life, escaping brushes with death. The laborers worshipped him as a direct servant of God. Toussaint kept his army overwhelmingly black and ex slave. He had personal advisors who all happened to be white men, but he did not let anyone influence him. He trusted no one. He loved children, and they loved him. Riding one day, a little orphan ran after him, calling, "Papa, Papa, take me away with you." He brought her home to his wife, and she became a member of the household. This was the sort of thing that bound him to a simple agricultural people. But Toussaint was no freak. The same forces which molded his genius had helped to create his black and mulatto generals and officials. Dessalines was the most famous of the black generals. By some, he was thought to excel Toussaint in military genius, yet it was late in his life before he learned to sign his name. He had no sympathy for Toussaint's policy of reconciliation with the whites, but he was dazzled by Toussaint's gifts and worshipped his chief. Moise was a different type, the most popular soldier in the army, beloved by the black people of the North for his championship of them against the whites. He was high in Toussaint's favor until he refused to carry out Toussaint's severe labor legislation in the North, at which point Toussaint sent observers to watch his administration. The whites decided if Moise ever ruled, they would leave. They lived in houses costing millions. Mass support had elevated them and maintained them in supreme power, and the responsibility gave them confidence. Toussaint was sending black and mulatto children to France at the public expense to be educated so that they might return and govern. All he wanted was time. But San Domingo was not destined to have peace. The white slave owners were a cause of discord at home, while the maritime bourgeois in France remembered always the fabulous profits of the slave trade. The whites, having no other choice, accepted Toussaint's regime. The black laborers did not approve of Toussaint's conciliatory policy toward the whites. They felt he showed too much favor to their old enemies. These anti white feelings of the black people were no infringement of liberty and equality, but were in reality the soundest revolutionary policy. It was fear of the counter revolution. Shortly after Toussaint issued one of his stern proclamations confining the black people to the plantations, some of these whites issued a proclamation of their own to the laborers, saying, "I shall treat you as before and shall show you you are not free." Toussaint still continued to favor the whites. Losing sight of his mass support, taking it for granted, he sought only to conciliate the whites at home and abroad. Meanwhile, Toussaint happened to strike up a correspondence with Napoleon Bonaparte's wife, Josephine, who owned a plantation in the colony. Toussaint would send his two sons over to the plantation where they spent leisure time, but at one point Bonaparte refused to send them back. Toussaint prepared for the inevitable war. He bought 30,000 guns from America and armed the laborers. He was not afraid to arm them because their interests were his. The war would devastate San Domingo as no war had ever devastated it before, letting loose barbarism and savagery again. But any large expedition could have no other aim than the restoration of slavery, so this was the only option. Toussaint worked to draft a constitution for San Domingo. He assembled 6 men who were all either white or mulatto, none were black. As always now, he was thinking of the effect in France, and not of the effect on his own masses, feeling too sure of them. The Constitution forever abolished slavery and declared every man was admissible to all employments. For the rest, Toussaint concentrated all power in his own hands. He was appointed governor for life, with power to choose his successor. What would strike any Frenchman about the Constitution is that it left no room for any French official. It was virtual independence. Toussaint published the Constitution in July of 1801. There were great celebrations held. Toussaint's constitution was a despotism, and the mulattoes did not like it. But what cared those thousands who sang and danced? The generals Christophe and Moise thought that Toussaint had gone too far, that he was acting like he was a king. Chapter 12. The bourgeoisie prepares to restore slavery. Toussaint's suspicions of the French were right. Bonaparte inquired what regime under which the colonies have most prospered, and hearing that the answer was the old regime, he decided to restore it, along with slavery and mulatto discrimination. He hated black people. The passion of the French Revolution now showed up as people huddling in the slums of Paris and Marseille, terrorized by the police under Napoleon. French and British bourgeoisie were in the middle of that struggle for world supremacy, which lasted over 20 years and devastated Europe. Napoleon was planning to try to take India from the British, and not wanting to be stretched too thin, prepared a letter to Toussaint beaming with goodwill. However, when the conquest of India no longer seemed strategic, the letter was discarded, and Napoleon prepared to destroy Toussaint. It is Toussaint's supreme merit that while he saw European civilization as a valuable and necessary thing, and strove to lay its foundations among his people, he never had the illusion that it conferred any moral superiority. He knew French, British, and Spanish imperialists for the insatiable gangsters that they were, that there is no oath too sacred for them to break, no crime, deception, treachery, cruelty, destruction of human life and property, which they would not commit against those who could not defend themselves. Vincent, the current agent of France for the colony, tried to impress upon Napoleon, who was planning an expedition in response to the Constitution, the strength of the colony and the extraordinary genius of the man who ruled there. Bonaparte was so angry he banished Vincent to the island of Elba. Vincent, who had previously tried to dissuade Toussaint from publishing the Constitution, failed, as all will fail who do not understand that in a revolution each must choose his side and stick to it. It was the largest expedition that had ever sailed from France, consisting of 20,000 veteran troops, under some of Napoleon's ablest officers. Slavery would be reestablished, civilization restarted, and a good time would be had by all. And in these last crucial moments, Toussaint, fully aware of Napoleon's preparations, was busy sawing off the branch on which he sat. In the north, the vanguard of the revolution were dissatisfied that they were still working for their white masters. Gone were the days when Toussaint would ride through the night to inquire into the laborers' grievances. Revolutionaries through and through, these bold men organized another insurrection. Their aim was to massacre the whites and overthrow Toussaint's government. This insurrection proved that they were following him because he represented that complete emancipation from their former degradation, which was their chief goal. As soon as they saw that he was no longer going to this end, they were ready to throw him over. Rioting was widespread over the north. Armed bands would kill any whites they met while traveling. Toussaint, Christophe, Dessalines, and Moise worked to put down the uprising. But in certain districts, those revolting cried out, "Long live Moise!" Toussaint therefore had Moise arrested, afraid that Moise might supplant him. After the commission gave judgment, Moise was executed. To the black people in the north, already angry at Toussaint's policy, the execution of Moise was the final disillusionment. They could not understand it. Toussaint had shot him for taking the part of the black people against the whites. Toussaint recognized this error and tried to explain it, but he was so set that he could only think of further repression. In the districts of the insurrection, he shot without mercy, lining up laborers and speaking to them in turn, deciding who would be shot on the basis of a stumbling answer or uncertainty. They were dominated into submission. He published a series of laws surpassing in severity anything he had yet decreed. There was a rigid passport system for all classes of the population. He confined the laborers to their plantations more strictly than ever. Anyone fomenting disorder could be condemned to 6 months' hard labor. He prohibited the soldiers from visiting a plantation except to see their fathers or mothers, and even then only for a limited period. He was now afraid of the contact between the Revolutionary Army and the people, an infallible sign of revolutionary degeneration. Meanwhile, he was reassuring the whites. Some of them rejoiced openly at rumors of the French expedition, and Toussaint, rather than killing them like the laborers, merely had them deported. Criticism is not enough. What should Toussaint have done? 150 years of history and the scientific study of revolution begun by Marx and Engels and amplified by Lenin and Trotsky justify us in pointing to an alternative course. Lenin and the Bolsheviks after the October Revolution faced much the same problem as Toussaint. Russian bourgeois culture was a relatively poor thing, but Lenin admitted frankly that it was superior to that of the proletariat and would have to be used until the proletariat had developed itself. He rigidly excluded the bourgeoisie from political power, but he proposed that they should be given important posts and good salaries higher than those of Communist Party members. The Bolsheviks kept Tsarist officers in their army the same way Toussaint kept whites in his, because neither revolution had enough trained and educated officers of its own. The whole theory of the Bolshevik policy was that the victories of the new regime would gradually win over those who had been constrained to accept it by force. Toussaint hoped for the same. But whereas Lenin kept the party and the masses thoroughly aware of every step, and explained carefully the exact position of the bourgeois servants of the workers' state, Toussaint explained nothing, and allowed the masses to think that their old enemies were being favored at their expense. Toussaint should have declared that a powerful expedition could have no other aim than the restoration of slavery, summoned the population to resist, declared independence, confiscated the property of all who refused to accept, and distributed among his supporters. With the issue unobscure and his power clear, many who might otherwise have hesitated would have come down on the side that was taking decisive action. It was the ex slave laborers and the ex slave army which would decide the issue, and Toussaint's policy was working against both. Instead of bringing the black laborers nearer, he drove them away from him. Even after the revolt, it was not too late. Lenin crushed the Kronstadt revolt with a relentless hand, but in a manner so abrupt as to call forth protests from sticklers for party discipline, he proposed the new economic policy immediately afterward. It was this quick recognition of danger that saved the Russian Revolution. But for Toussaint, instead of recognizing that the origin of the revolt was springing from fear of the same enemy that he was arming against, he was sterner with the revolutionaries than he had ever been before. Toussaint's severity and proclamation reassuring the whites aimed at showing Napoleon that all classes were safe in San Domingo and that he could be trusted to govern the colony. This is Toussaint's greatest condemnation. Napoleon was not going to be convinced by Toussaint's justice and fairness and capacity to govern. If Toussaint, to make matters clear, had to condone a massacre of the whites, so much the worse for the whites. He had done everything possible for them, and if the race question occupied the place that it did in San Domingo, it was not the fault of the black people. But Toussaint, like Robespierre, destroyed his own left wing, and with it sealed his own doom. The tragedy is that there was no need for it. Robespierre struck at the masses because he was bourgeois and they were communist. The clash was inevitable. But between Toussaint and his people, there was no fundamental difference of outlook or aim. He bewildered the masses at the very moment that he needed them most, and to bewilder the masses is to strike the deadliest of all blows at the revolution. Meanwhile, Dessalines had found the correct method. He gave speeches to the army saying, If France wishes to try any nonsense here, everybody must rise together, men and women, to loud cheers. Dessalines had not the slightest desire to reassure the whites. It was the black laborers who had to do the fighting, and it was they who needed reassurance. That December, the first French fleet arrived at the island while Toussaint watched. He returned to his staff and said, "We shall perish. All France has come to overwhelm us." Chapter 13. The War of Independence. The defeat of Toussaint in the War of Independence and his imprisonment and death in Europe are universally looked on as a tragedy. Even at the height of the war, Toussaint saw the French connection as necessary to Haiti. What revolutionary France signified was perpetually on his lips, in public statements and his correspondence. It was the highest stage of social existence that he could imagine. At the same time, he was equally certain that slavery could never be restored. Between these two certainties, he, in whom prompt decision had become second nature, became the embodiment of vacillation. His allegiance to the French Revolution had made him what it was, but this in the end ruined him. Napoleon wrote out the plan of the campaign in San Domingo with his own hand. He divided it into three periods. In the first, General Leclerc was to promise to Toussaint everything he asked for, in order that Leclerc might establish himself in the principal points of the country. Toussaint was then to be shipped to France along with his supporters. If they did not cooperate, they were to be declared traitors and hunted down. The last stage was the disarming of the population. The first thing was to break the military power of the black people. No black person above the rank of captain was to be left in the island. Bonaparte kept his intentions of restoring slavery a secret. Many officers and all the soldiers believed that they were fighting for the revolution against Toussaint, a traitor who was sold to the British. In February, Leclerc appeared off the harbor of Le Cap with 5,000 men. Whites and everyone who was free during slavery were radiant, but the officers of the army, both black and mulatto, were grimly hostile and would not speak to the French. News came that Fort Liberté had been taken by the French. It was war. The French set fires in the Cap, which led to an explosion that had rocks tumbling down, crushing women and children who were hiding in the hills. All night the fire raged, destroying property. The next day, only 59 out of 2,000 houses remained. This was the beginning of a devastation which threw San Domingo back half a century. War is a continuation of politics by other means, and Toussaint was now reaping the reward of his policy during the previous year. The laborers, hostile to the French, did not respond to his call. They could not understand why Toussaint should call on them to fight these whites when all his policy had been towards conciliation of them. Mulattoes and former free black people were openly for the French. San Domingo was a French colony. Why should they burn down their property for Toussaint's ambition? The French took the capital, Port Républicain. The next night came an offer of submission from La Plume, commanding in the south. Even at Santo Domingo, where Paul Louverture was in command, the French had another easy success. As the blows fell upon Toussaint, he braced himself not for surrender, but for resistance. The dream of orderly government and progress to civilization was over. Events were to show that if he had but mobilized the masses before and purged his army, the French attack would have been nullified from the start. Toussaint's desire to avoid destruction was the very thing that caused it. It is the recurring error of moderates when face to face with a revolutionary struggle. Dessalines, however, needed no instructions to take appropriate action. He ranged from one part of the colony to the other, wearing out the French troops. Men, women, and children, indeed all the whites who came into his hands, he massacred. And forbidding burial, he left stacks of corpses rotting in the sun to strike terror into the French detachments as they toiled behind his flying columns. Leclerc took advantage of the fact that Toussaint's sons were being held by the Bonaparte family. He offered Toussaint his sons back at the price of Toussaint's surrender. After Toussaint proposed a suspension of hostilities, Leclerc sent his sons to him. Toussaint allowed each son to decide for himself whether he would be on the side of the French or of San Domingo. His son Isaac declared for France, but Placide chose San Domingo, and Toussaint gave him command of a battalion. Upon receiving reinforcements, Leclerc issued a proclamation putting Toussaint and Christophe outside the law and planned an attack on them. Many of Toussaint's troops had gone over to the French side, so he could only delay and harass their advance, devastating the country to deprive Leclerc of supplies. His plan was to raid Leclerc's outposts, make surprise attacks, lay ambushes while avoiding major engagements. Then, with the coming of the rains, the French would fall victims in thousands to the fever, and the black troops could drive them out. The French troops did not guess that they were fighting to restore slavery. The war was, for them, a revolutionary war. But Toussaint's soldiers and generals, illiterates and ex slaves, had been molded by the same revolution. An army is a miniature of the society which produces it. If the Black Army had wobbled before the French, it was because San Domingo society as a whole did not know what to think of Leclerc's expedition. But the few thousand who remained faithful to Toussaint were the advance guard of the Revolutionary Army fighting a revolutionary war. The liberty and equality which these people acclaimed as they went into battle meant far more to them than the same words in the mouths of the French. And in a revolutionary struggle, these things are worth many regiments. Leclerc's execution of the first phase of Napoleon's plan had failed completely. Toussaint, Christophe, and Dessalines had their forces intact, held the internal lines of communication, and were in touch with each other. However, the Black Army faced the difficulty that it was not always clear what their war was for. Toussaint had still not declared independence and had never made a clear pronouncement about Leclerc's intention to restore slavery. Defections made the circumstances more difficult for those remaining, leading to many of them submitting to the French as well. Commander Maurepas, through defections, became exposed to the French, who threatened him with annihilation if he did not join them. Maurepas submitted. The vacillation of the leaders was killing the revolutionary ardor at every turn. Worse still, to prove his loyalty, Maurepas was set to clear the country of the revolting masses. Maurepas at this point had no choice. The masses now saw themselves hunted down and rounded up by white troops aided by the men whom they had hitherto looked upon as their staunchest defenders. However, Dessalines, while being pursued in battle by the French general de Belle, brought his troops to a fortress at Cretapiero, where he and his men jumped into a ditch, leaving the French who were pursuing them exposed. They mowed down 400 French soldiers and wounded 2 generals. After this first round of fighting, Dessalines spoke to his troops and said, "The French will not be able to remain long in San Domingo. I shall make you independent. There will be no more whites among us." Independence. It was the first time that a leader had put it before his men. Here was not only a program, but tactics. The lying and treacherous Bonaparte and Leclerc had met their match at last. From there, more French troops attempted to attack Dessalines' position at Cretapiero, but Dessalines kept the upper hand. In one round of attack, his troops wounded Leclerc and killed 800 French soldiers, and in the next, they wounded Rochambeau and killed 300. So, at this point, at Cretapiero, the French had lost 1,500 men. Leclerc was getting very, very anxious at this point. It was now halfway through March, and the rainy season was almost there, which would bring illness to his troops. The French soldiers were retaliating against Dessalines' relentless murder of all whites and began shooting prisoners, hundreds of black people at a time. But the dishonest political position of the French army was now taking its toll. The soldiers still thought of themselves as a revolutionary army, yet at nights they heard the black soldiers in the fortress singing the revolutionary songs. Lacroix records how these misguided wretches, as they heard the songs, started and looked at the officers as if to say, "Have our barbarous enemies justice on their side? Are we no longer the soldiers of Republican France? And have we become the crude instruments of policy?" A regiment of Poles, remembering their own struggle for nationalism, refused to join in the massacre of the black prisoners. Every day of war was piling up mountains in the way of Bonaparte's clear and precise instructions. Leclerc eventually captured Credipiero, which was a great victory for him. But it was a victory that had cost too much. Leclerc had lost 2,000 men there, and he begged his officers to lie about the number of casualties in their reports. To read English and French accounts of their operations in San Domingo, one would believe that but for yellow fever they would have easily been victorious. But up to April there had been no yellow fever, and yet in the 8 weeks of February and March 17,000 French veterans had landed, and of them 5,000 were dead, 5,000 were in hospital, and Leclerc had not made his way through the first stage of Napoleon's plan. The hunting down of the black generals who would not present themselves to be deported was a total failure. Toussaint, who at this point was behind the revolution, was still hoping to come to terms with Leclerc. He wrote a letter to Napoleon assuring him of his devotion, and spoke as if Leclerc had acted in opposition to Napoleon's instructions. By this offer, Toussaint gave Napoleon the opportunity to withdraw from a hopeless expedition with dignity. It was magnificent diplomacy, but ruinous as a revolutionary policy. Toussaint gave Christophe permission to negotiate with Leclerc. Leclerc proposed to Christophe to seize Toussaint. Leclerc assured him of his good faith, promised to maintain him and all his officers in their commands, and Christophe submitted. It was a terrific blow to the revolution. Christophe has been blamed, but the fault was entirely Toussaint's. His combination of fierce offensives with secret negotiations was too tortuous a method for Christophe. It was a policy suited for war between two national states, not for a revolutionary war. Once more, the masses had received a shattering blow, not from the bullets of the enemy, but from where the masses most often receive it, from their own trembling leaders. Along with Christophe, the French received 1,200 soldiers, 100 pieces of cannon, ammunition, and 2,000 white inhabitants, as well as Lambay and Port Francais. But Leclerc was now thoroughly afraid of Toussaint and preferred to negotiate rather than fight. After a conference lasting several hours, Toussaint's submission was arranged on three conditions: indisputable liberty for all in San Domingo, maintenance in their grades and functions of all the native officers, Toussaint to keep his staff and retire where he wished on the territory of the colony. Despite the submission, the victory was still with Toussaint. He persuaded Dessalines to submit also. Leclerc was full of chagrin at his failure to carry out Napoleon's instructions, and began lying in his letters to France. Toussaint had lost the confidence of Dessalines, who was no longer looking to him for leadership, but was working out his own road to independence. He determined to get Toussaint out of the way, as well as Christophe, for their pro-French leanings. He knew his chief well enough to doubt his capacity to take the steps that Dessalines saw would be necessary. He had his program for national independence ready. On June 7th, French General Brunet wrote to Toussaint asking for a meeting at his headquarters. If Toussaint did not attend this interview for fear of arrest, he would have to flee and begin the war again, in a position infinitely worse than before. On the other hand, it was unlikely that Leclerc would dare to arrest him while Dessalines and the other generals still had command of their troops. Toussaint met with Brunet, and after speaking for a few minutes, Brunet excused himself. At this point, some grenadiers with fixed bayonets entered the house, saying, "General, we have not come to do you any harm. We merely have orders to secure your person." Toussaint submitted. They bound him up like a common criminal, arrested his family, stole his possessions, destroyed his plantations, and rushed the family on board a frigate in the harbor of Le Cap and embarked them for France. Stepping on board the boat, Toussaint said to the captain, In overthrowing me, you have cut down in San Domingo only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are numerous and deep. It was July, and Leclerc, months behind his instructions, now had to disarm the revolutionary North, where insurrection was spreading daily. But why would they give up their arms? Sonthonax had told them, "If you wish to keep your liberty, use your arms on the day that the white authorities ask you for them, because any such request is the infallible sign and precursor of the return to slavery." While the former black generals now hunted down the insurrectionists, the insurrection continued to grow. In early July, the rumors began to spread through the island that the French government was restoring slavery. Once more, the masses had shown greater political understanding than their leaders. In France, votes were held to restore slavery, but they did not start with San Domingo, but rather Martinique, Ile de Bourbon, and other islands. The vote to restore slavery in these places passed 211 votes to 60. But the maritime bourgeois was clamoring for more. One night, a group of black people being deported from Guadeloupe jumped overboard their ship, swam to San Domingo, and gave the news that slavery had been restored in Guadeloupe. The insurrection became general. This unexpected exposure of Bonaparte's secret intentions threw Leclerc into mortal terror. He wrote home, "It is not enough to have taken away Toussaint. There are 2,000 leaders to be taken away." But still, the black and mulatto generals were fighting for Leclerc against the insurrectionists. A black general dining with Leclerc pointed to his two daughters and asked him, "Are these to go back to slavery?" It was as if they could not believe it. So your liberal or social democrat hesitates and dithers until the sledgehammer of fascism falls on his head, or a Franco launches his carefully prepared counter-revolution. Leclerc was merely waiting for reinforcements to arrest and deport these leaders. It was only the strength of the insurrection which was preventing him. In despair, Leclerc called a meeting of the colonists and generals to consider what was to be done to stop the ever-spreading insurrection. The colonists were unanimous. No slavery, no colony. Only then did it seem that the black and mulatto generals understood that there was no hope. Leclerc wrote home to say, "We have in Europe a false idea of the country in which we fight and the men whom we fight against." The mulattoes were for the most part hostile to the return of slavery, and their leader, Pétion, launched an attack on the French. Dessalines had been waiting. As soon as he learned of the attack, he gave word to his supporters to be ready to raise the laborers at a given signal. Meanwhile, a call for Dessalines' arrest had already been put out when the action started. He was surrounded in his house by French troops, but narrowly escaped on horseback, fired 3 pistol shots in the air, and cried out, "To arms! To arms!" After a couple days, Christophe stopped hesitating and joined in. On November 2nd, Leclerc died. But before he died, he knew that he had failed, and that San Domingo was lost to France. Of 34,000 French soldiers who had landed, 24,000 were dead, 8,000 were in hospital, and 2,000 exhausted men remained. Thousands of brave black soldiers were dead for no other crime than that of refusing to be slaves once more. The population in San Domingo had been transformed. No one could have guessed the power that was born in them when Boukman gave the signal for revolt on that stormy night in August 1791. Now, the new nation was to undergo its final test. What happened in San Domingo after Leclerc's death is one of those pages of history which every schoolboy should learn, and most certainly will learn someday. For self-sacrifice and heroism, the men, women, and children who drove out the French stand second to no fighters for independence in any place or time. And the reason was simple. They had seen at last that without independence they could not maintain their liberty, and liberty was far more concrete for former slaves than the elusive forms of political democracy in France. Rochambeau succeeded Leclerc, and he was confident of success. He captured Fort Dauphin and Port-de-Paix and grew even more confident. Dessalines traveled over the island, reorganizing the local troops. Many no longer trusted him. He and Pétion won them over or hunted them down and destroyed them. In the middle of January, Rochambeau asked for authorization to restore slavery at once. Rochambeau began on his own account to exterminate the mulattoes. The French shot and drowned them, hundreds at a time, and not only shot the rich, but confiscated their property. By early March, the mulatto South was in full insurrection. Rochambeau received 20,000 men after the cleric's death, but by now Dessalines was ready. Rochambeau brought in dogs to hunt down the black people. The French burned alive, hanged, drowned, tortured, and started again their old habit of burying black people up to the neck near nests of insects. It was not only hatred and fear, but policy. The whites thought, kill them all off and get new ones who know nothing about liberty and equality. Dessalines was the man for this crisis, not Toussaint. He gave blow for blow, but it was the people who won the victory. They burned San Domingo flat so that at the end of the war it was a charred desert. "Why do you burn everything?" asked a French officer of a prisoner. "We have a right to burn what we cultivate, because a man has the right to dispose of his own labor," was the reply. And far from being intimidated, the civil population met the terror with such courage and firmness as frightened the terrorists. The French, powerless before this fortitude, saw in it not the strength of the revolution, but some peculiarity special to black people. The muscles of a Negro, they said, contracted with so much force as to make him insensible to pain. They enslaved the Negro, they said, because he was not a man, and when he behaved like a man, they called him a monster. Back in France, Napoleon decided not to murder Toussaint judicially because he feared the repercussions in San Domingo of a trial and execution. But he was to be got rid of, and Napoleon decided to kill him by ill treatment, cold, and starvation. Neglected in his cell, Toussaint begged for trial. Despite the treachery of France, he still saw himself as a part of the French Republic, one and indivisible. Before the spring, he was dying. One April morning, he was found dead in his chair. There is no drama like the drama of history. Toussaint died on April 7th, 1803, and Napoleon must have thought that half the battle against San Domingo was now won. But in Toussaint's last hours, his comrades in arms, ignorant of his fate, were drafting the Declaration of Independence. A division broke out between the French army and the local whites. They had been willing to live under Toussaint. When the clerk came, they had joined his army and grasped eagerly at the chance to reassert white domination. But now that they saw their plantations destroyed, San Domingo in ruins, their lives in danger, and their possessions confiscated, they turned on Rochambeau, some being anxious now only for peace with the black people. The struggle became hopeless for the French, hopeless in their own internal divisions, hopeless in the numbers against them and the spirit which moved in the black army. On November 16th, the black and mulatto troops concentrated for a last attack on the Cap. Rochambeau held a council of war and decided to evacuate the island. Toussaint had been dead only 7 months, but his work was done. Of men who had cowered trembling before the frown of any white ruffian, he had made in 10 years an army which could hold its own with the finest soldiers Europe has yet seen. "There is no longer any doubt, my dear general," wrote the triumphant Dessalines to one of his officers. "The country is ours, and the famous who will have it is decided." On December 31st, 1803, the final Declaration of Independence was read. To emphasize the break with the French, the new state was renamed Haiti. Dessalines attempted to take Spanish San Domingo, but the French Revolution had never had support there, and he failed. On October 1804, he had himself crowned emperor. Early in the new year, 1805, the whites in Haiti were massacred by the orders of Dessalines. The patience and forbearance of the poor are among the strongest bulwarks of the rich. The black laborers of San Domingo had had provocation enough from the whites to justify the massacre of 3 times their number. While this massacre receives a lot of attention in history, what does not receive equal attention is the fact that at a Congress in December, Three Englishmen had swore that England would only trade with San Domingo and accord their protection for its independence when the last of the whites had fallen under the axe. These civilized cannibals, in their greed for trade, wanted to drive a wedge between Haiti and France to break all possibilities of unity. This is one of the most infamous and unjustifiable crimes in all this wretched history, though there is no evidence the Americans were probably in on it too. Following that meeting, in February and March, there was a French squadron spotted in a harbor on the island, and a rumor of another. Feeling that Haiti was menaced, it was at this point that Dessalines began the massacre, protecting the British and American whites, and sparing also the priests, skilled workmen, and officers of health. Napoleon confessed that his expedition had been a mistake, and he should have ruled the island through Toussaint. He had been convinced at last by the only argument that imperialists understand. The massacre of the whites was a tragedy, not for the whites. The tragedy was for the black people and mulattoes. It was not policy, but revenge, and revenge has no place in politics. The people did not want it. All they wanted was freedom, and independence seemed to promise that. Haiti suffered terribly from the resulting isolation. Whites were banished from Haiti for generations, and the unfortunate country, ruined economically, its population lacking in social culture, had its inevitable difficulties doubled by this massacre. The French bourgeoisie bided its time. Always they planned to restore slavery, but they failed. The imperialists envisaged an eternity of African exploitation. The African is backward, ignorant. They dream dreams. If today one were to suggest to any white colonial official that among the black people they rule are men so infinitely their superior in ability, energy, range of vision, and tenacity of purpose that in 100 years' time these whites would be remembered only because of their contact with them, one would get some idea of what the colonial magnates of the day thought of Toussaint and Rigaud when the revolt first began. Black people in Africa today are nearer ready than were the slaves of San Domingo. People will arise. From the people heaving in action will come the leaders, the quiet recruits in a black police force, the sergeant in the French native army or British police, familiarizing himself with military tactics and strategy, reading a stray pamphlet of Lenin or Trotsky as Toussaint read the Abbé Raynal. Nor will success result in the isolation of Africa. The black people will demand skilled workmen and teachers. International socialism will need the products of a free Africa far more than the French bourgeoisie needed the slave trade. Imperialism vaunts its exploitation of the wealth of Africa for the benefit of civilization. In reality, from the very nature of its system of production for profit, it strangles the real wealth of the continent, the creative capacity of the African people. The African faces a long and difficult road, and he will need guidance. But he will tread it fast, because he will walk upright.